I want to welcome you all to this fabulous event. Let me start by really profusely thanking our partners in making this event happen tonight. The Clean Energy Trust, Argonne National Lab, and the Chicago Innovation Exchange. Thanks especially to CIE for providing us with this really magnificent space. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our host tonight, Steve Levine. Now, you can all read Steve's bio on Quartz, Atlantic Media's fabulous, slick website for digital news, where he writes about the intersection of energy, technology, and geopolitics as their Washington correspondent. But I thought, for those of you who are not in this space, I would just provide a little color on sort of Steve's background and how I've sort of known and followed Steve over the years. I think he's really been an insightful voice and chronicler of oil and energy and geopolitics for really my entire career. First with his 2007 book, The Oil and the Glory. And it was sort of a magnificent history of the oil industry in the 1990s, focused specifically on the former Soviet Union and the Caspian oil rush. As an analyst working on the geopolitics of oil, the future of state-run oil companies, and U.S. energy security at the time, I can tell you I found the work to be really indispensable. In 2009's Putin's Labyrinth, Steve authored what's been called a gripping account of modern Russia, told through the lives and deaths of 6 Russians. Built on his decade of experience living and reporting in Russia, the book uses firsthand interviews and eyewitness accounts to offer insight into the thinking of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And again, really indispensable for those of us who would then spend the next several years trying to figure out how Russia was going to impact the global oil market and European gas markets. Now, around that time, I did my first work on electric vehicles, specifically looking at sort of their potential to penetrate U.S. markets and the implications for U.S. energy security and oil demand. And I'd spent a lot of time on that from around the time that Steve's book in 2009 came out until I first came to U Chicago in 2015. And right at that time, Steve published his latest book, The Powerhouse. It's a fascinating look into the race for cost-competitive energy storage, an innovation that would upend everything from the grid and transportation to oil markets and the future of the Middle East. And best of all, the book focused on the incredible work happening just outside of Chicago at Argonne National Lab. And you'll hear some of those, some speakers from Argonne tonight. So his columns at Quartz are really a must-read. He was one of the first journalists to begin highlighting research that suggested a drop in oil prices was imminent back in 2014. So he was really sort of ahead of the game. And I can tell you that I've been trying to get Steve to come here since I first came here, so I'm very excited to have him with us. Having benefited from his hosting skills in the past, I can tell you that we're in for a real treat tonight. So please join me in welcoming Steve Levine.
That is the best introduction I've ever received. Thanks very much, Sam, for inviting me here. Thanks to the Energy Policy Institute. The last time I saw Sam, he was in his previous guys at SAFE in Washington, and he looks much happier here. I wanted to say what a huge honor it is for me to moderate this particular event. Sam mentioned the last book I did, The Powerhouse, and the thesis there, of course, was that we were at the cusp of a huge breakthrough in battery capability that would enable a new age of electric cars and stationary energy that would then have knock-on impacts in geopolitics. And the idea, though, was to step back, use that as the backdrop, and the foreground of the story was to spend time, 1 year, with a group of scientists that were trying to make this big impact. That if they succeeded, they would save the world. And pretty quickly, like immediately, when I started looking around at which lab I should focus on, where should I spend that year, Argonne came on my radar screen, and it took, well, I flew out there, of course, and spent some time with them, but it took a year of negotiation after that to get them to let me in. They've regretted it ever since, but this is true. Kevin here's going, yeah, but I'm very grateful for that time, and that is the book. The book is It ended up being 2 years, 2 years sitting in that lab. I teach on Tuesday nights at Georgetown, so basically Wednesdays through Fridays spent at the lab with the battery researchers and just watching them go about their works. So it's appropriate tonight that we're going to look at the new age, what's coming next in renewables, in clean energy, through the eyes of three researchers and thinkers at Argonne. I wanted to step back a bit and just give a big picture, the way that I look at energy, of which batteries and solar and the grid are all one piece. And that's, a few weeks ago, you all know that Mohammed bin Salman, the Deputy Crown Minister of Saudi Arabia, announced a plan. Saudi Arabia, the biggest oil producer in the world, was going to get off oil. He's announced a plan to sell off part of Aramco, create a $2 trillion sovereign wealth fund, and to invest half of it in non-oil industries. And this is a signal. Why is Saudi Arabia doing this? Why is Mohammed bin Salman doing this? Because he and the brain trust there, Saudi Arabia, for whatever its reputation is a very smart country. These are not tin pot dictators. They're not fools, and they know what they're doing. And the outlook there is that the world is in a slow decline coming off of oil, and Saudi Arabia being reliant 95% of the state budget on oil revenue. His outlook is, we've got to get away from this, and we're going to lead the way. And that was one of the things he did, was to decide we're going to sell off part of Aramco. But he and his group also declared a war of geology against the United States, against Iran and Russia. The idea being that in a new age in which demand for oil was dropping, the idea of price, of scarcity, was going out of the window, and it was every man for himself. That's what we're watching today. And the result of this is that petrostates around the world are seriously fiscally stressed, with no relief in sight. But why? Why is the world suddenly? Why is world demand for oil suddenly dropping? Well, if you ask Exxon and OPEC and the IEA and so on, they say the world demand for oil is not dropping. But in a way, that's true, right? It's going up, but it's very soon in the mid-2020s. The trajectory is it's going on a decline. Young people are driving less, or they're not driving at all. Efficiency of automobiles is becoming greater. Social tastes are changing, and demographic tastes are changing. Elon Musk has come onto the market. Virtually every major car maker in the world is either already producing or on its drawing board, or will produce over the next 5 years a vehicle, an electric vehicle meant specifically to challenge, to meet the challenge that Elon Musk has presented with Tesla. The question until recent months always was, well, it's great that Musk is so cool, and so many people with too much money to spend and who want to look green are buying his cars, but will large numbers of people buy his cars? And on March 31, and in the weeks going forward, we saw almost 400,000 people put down pre-orders for his Model 3, and that was the signal that this age is very real. And the forecast now is that in the 2020s that millions of pure electric vehicles will be sold every year, shaving off oil demand for a start somewhere in the mid-2020s. Between 2023 and 2028 will shave off 2 million barrels a day of oil. Again, putting this pressure. This is part of the scenario that Mohammed bin Salman saw when he decided that Saudi Arabia was going to get off oil. But the other factor in this whole big scenario is climate change. Right? It's the scene of melting ice, droughts around the world, countries and states flooding, and the knowledge that around the world, the recognition that we need to do something. We're doing a lot, right? Shale gas has reduced momentously the volume of coal that we're burning, but we need to do more. The progress that is being made in reducing the emissions of carbon through natural means, just through the economy, is getting us so far, but we need big advances in technology. And that's what the discussion is today. How do those advances get made? What advances need to be made to get to reduce the most apocalyptic scenarios of future climate change? So we have our three speakers. Our first is Leah Guzowski. I've known Leah for several years, since almost when I first started going to Argonne. She's in charge of strategy and research programs at Argonne. Leah is going to give the big picture, and I think is going to focus on the grid. Thanks.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to spend some time with all of you tonight. It's truly my pleasure to be here, and thank you, of course, to EPIC and to Steve and the University of Chicago for having us here tonight. So I am here tonight to talk about the future of the grid. That's, of course, a very big and important topic. And I'm afraid I'm going to start this talk off in a somewhat disappointing way. I'm going to start by talking about the current grid. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, I came here for a talk on the future grid, what am I doing? But I just want to set the stage by providing a baseline of where we're currently at. So if you turn your attention to the right, you see a diagram here. And this is really the way the grid has looked for quite some time. You have generation, transmission, and distribution, and then electricity reaches the consumer. Now, this has been a modern marvel, and it has truly changed all of our lives in the most fundamental way. But there are certainly some issues that come up with our current grid. So let me just point out a few of those before we start talking about the future of the grid. So the first is that it truly is a one-way power flow. As you all know, when you need electricity, you plug a device in, and that's it. You're done, you go on with your life, that's all. There's really no way for consumers to interact with electricity as it currently stands today, although that is changing. We currently have instant generation and demand, so everything is just in time. It's not really like a shipping warehouse where you can store things and you can keep things and use it when you need it. We have a challenge integrating renewables with this situation. And as it currently stands, we have centralized power with long transmission lines, and of course this leads to fragile points as well. So I just wanted to set the stage by kind of where we're currently at and what are some of the more significant challenges that we're facing. But then where are we going? So the future grid, this is a very challenging thing to put on one side, but we tried. So we hit a couple of key points here. You're going to hear from my colleagues later, Seth, who will talk about distributed sources. You'll hear from Kevin, who will talk about energy storage. And the really key here is that we see many of these different components becoming much more integrated. And you start seeing consumers being able to interact more with their energy sources. And you see buildings also becoming more intelligent in the way that they interact with the grid. So let's get into the future grid a bit more. So I've structured this talk in terms of a couple of different angles. So let's talk about why now, and then I'd like to share some solutions of what we're actually doing at Argonne in innovation in this space. Now, rather than just focus on exactly what's going on in the grid, I really want to focus today on what is driving the future of the grid. So there are all sorts of drivers that I couldn't do any justice to in a 10 to 15 minute talk, so I picked 4 examples that I'd like to focus in on today. The first is global urbanization, the second is climate, the third is renewable energy, and the fourth is grid vulnerabilities. For each of these topics, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on, why now, the challenges, and then we'll offer a solution of what's going on. So let's start with global urbanization. So we all sit here in Chicago. I think it's important to have a global perspective when we talk about urbanization. As it stands right now, 17% of the global population lacks access to electricity. That's changing. So for the first time, we're seeing over half of the population live in urban areas. And this is projected to increase to about 70% by 2050. So this is a speed of urbanization never recorded before in human history, and mainly in the developing world. So the data will show what you probably think. We see increased energy consumption, particularly in China and in India, and relatively baseline in OECD countries. So what is Argonne doing in terms of innovation? What are we doing to improve urbanization? Well, one of the examples that I like to use is a continuing effort to build integrated city-scale modeling and simulation. So what you're looking at right here is an integrated energy demand model with transportation. The idea of this is that you can actually start doing different scenarios in near real time and working with urban planners to look at, okay, how do we build new cities? How do we redevelop existing cities to be more energy efficient? So let's shift now to a topic that Steve briefly touched on, climate. Something that, as you so correctly noted, is critically important for our future. And how does this relate to the grid? Well, we know about 67% of energy use and 60% of greenhouse gas emissions are from electricity and transportation. And again, Steve, as you noted, we are experiencing global CO2 levels that we have never recorded before. And what does this mean? Well, of course, we're seeing impact. We're seeing in the United States alone about $25 to $75 billion of economic damages due to outages from natural disasters. And of course, there are many other tremendous impacts that we don't have time to get in here tonight, but the point is to raise the issue so we can talk about it more in discussion. So what is Argonne doing when it comes to innovation and climate change? Well, we're using our high-performance computing capability to do downscale climate modeling. What you're looking at here is a temperature difference between 10-year averages. And we use this, we can do different scenarios in terms of what will happen with climate change, and we can use this to better predict what different climate change scenarios will look like. This is particularly important and interesting because as we actually work and talk with cities, we're finding that folks are saying, yes, we understand this, we're experiencing more significant natural disasters, but we don't really know what that means for our city. So Argonne is really working to change that. We're working to build and develop scenarios where we can actually say, what does this mean for specific, right now we're working at about the 12-kilometer level. These are different data points that we ran for the city of Chicago. Again, in the interest of time, the short story here is that if these predictions hold, Chicago will experience warmer and wetter temperatures. So let's shift a little bit now to renewable energy and what is going on in the renewable energy space. So what we know is that solar and wind, for example, are both growing rapidly in terms of their annual capacity. But as you can see, their output can be quite variable. So this creates challenges. So of course we have uncertainty, we have changes in load, we have changes in generating capacity, and now we have changes in solar and wind power. So that poses a question to us in terms of our operating reserves and how do we actually handle those. So again, going back to what is the innovation that is going on in this space, we're using our high performance computing. Right now we have Mira, which you see here, to actually do different models and scenarios of how to optimize solar and wind into the existing grid. To give you some kind of context for the high performance computing capabilities of the laboratory, if every man, woman, and child did one calculation per second for the next 2 weeks, it would be what this machine would take 1 second to do. And we're currently in the process of a new machine which will be 18 times more powerful. Now we'll shift a little bit to grid vulnerabilities and what's going on in terms of the vulnerabilities that the grid is currently facing. So right now, we've developed a grid from 1882, more or less. You see Thomas Edison there, where he developed the first commercial power grid at the Pearl Street Station. To now, we have over 5,800 major power plants and 450,000 miles of high voltage transmission line. So this is an incredible accomplishment, but we're also currently facing aging infrastructure. And we also have vulnerable infrastructure. So this is an example that I wanted to bring up of the PG&E Metcalf station. This was a couple of years ago, April of 2013. What we experienced was right around 1 a.m., attackers of this particular facility cut out the telephone lines, and they opened fire on a substation. And transformers all over the substation started crashing. So clearly, the grid is vulnerable both to physical and cyber attacks as well. And I'd be remiss not to point out, of course, to other friends as well. So what are we doing in terms of grid vulnerabilities, and how are we actually working to improve that? Well, I think a really great example of some of the work that's going on at Argonne is in next generation microgrid controls and operations. We're currently partnering with ComEd and many other institutions, including IIT and others, to develop a project that is actually looking at 2 different microgrids and developing the advanced algorithms and controls for those 2 microgrids to interact with one another, and to also consider predictive weather patterns in terms of what that microgrid how that microgrid will actually behave to different types of situations. So there are many things going on that are driving the future of the grid. I hit on only 4 of them very briefly today and offered a brief glimpse into the projects and the work that's going on at Argonne. We talked a little bit about global urbanization. We talked about climate, renewable energy, and grid vulnerabilities. The one thing that is certain is that the grid is changing. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Leah. That was a terrific overview. One of the things that I think people don't realize is recognize much is that we're kind of in the second stage of this renewable game, right? We in 2008, 2009, we all heard a lot about solar, grid, electric cars, and then a bunch of failures, right? 2012 and 2013. Well, now all of these are back, and they're very, very real. I mean, the economics are much different. I'm going to introduce Seth Darling right now, who's a nanoscientist, and he's in charge of solar energy systems at Argonne. But Seth sent me before you come up. Seth sent me briefly his notes of what just his main overview. I'm going to give your whole talk right now of what he was going to say, and one of these details. So he said, so we need in the future the added solar or the added carbon-free energy we need by 2050 to stave off the worst aspects of climate change. 20 terawatts. All right. Does anyone know what a terawatt is? Oh, okay, this is cool. So I didn't know. All right, so I looked it up. All right, so this is the only thing I'm going to do. Okay, this is probably your first slide. All right. The entire human race used 18 terawatts of energy in 2012. 18. So this is more than that. This is more than everything used in 2012. Is that pretty good? All right.
All right, so they told me to talk to you guys about the future of energy. I put solar in parentheses because you'll see that I think this has to be the biggest piece of the solution going forward. So Leah already alluded to this projection for energy demand going forward. So as long as humans have been around, we've been using more energy every year than the year before, and that's true going out into the future, even all the way out to the year 2100. And most of this projection between now and 2050 is coming from the developing world, as she said, China, India, ultimately places like Africa as well. So today we use about 18 terawatts worldwide. That's 18 trillion watts. You can see that by the year 2050, that's projected to be 30 terawatts. So by the year 2050, we're going to be using almost twice as much energy worldwide as we're using today. So where do we get almost all of our energy from today? Coal's the biggest one. What else? Oil, gas. Those are the three biggest. The fossil fuels, that's where almost all of our energy comes from. One more question, why? It's cheapest. What I want to convince you of, though, is that that energy costs a lot more than you think it does. We are all paying much more than we realize for that energy. We're not paying it to ComEd or whomever your electricity provider is. You're not paying it at the gas pump or to People's Energy or wherever you get your natural gas from. We're paying all these extra costs in other places. Just one example. I give talks to school groups a lot. Teachers from the Pilsen area, the neighborhood a little west of here, near a coal-fired power plant that fortunately actually was just shut down recently. But they would tell me that they would have a kid absent from school almost every day because of asthma, caused by the ozone and particulates coming out of those coal-fired power plants. Those kids end up in an emergency room. That health care costs money. Who pays for that? We do. It's on our health insurance bill, not on our ComEd bill. Just one example. So some folks have tried to calculate how big are these hidden costs associated with energy, climate disruption being probably the largest of all. And the recent report from the IMF just last year estimated that in 1 year, the hidden costs, not the cost that you see, but the hidden costs associated with energy were about $5.3 trillion. So this is a measurable fraction of our global GDP here. So going forward, those hidden costs are going to skyrocket as well, not just because we're using more energy, but because climate disruption is going to get significantly worse. And so if we want to avoid this, we need to turn to other sources of energy. What are our options? So here I've sized boxes to represent roughly how much energy is feasible worldwide from these different energy sources. And don't take them as exact numbers, they're approximate. So fossil fuels could in principle power the entire planet even in the year 2050. You could get 30 terawatts of power from fossil fuels. We heard about end of oil, but there's probably 1,000 years worth of coal in the ground. This isn't something we're going to run out of anytime soon. Hopefully that's not going to be what our energy mix will be in the future. You could scale up nuclear to power almost the entire planet. To get to that type of scale, though, you'd have to build a new nuclear power plant every day, starting today, all the way to the year 2050. And you'd actually have to keep building them because they have a certain lifetime and you'd be retiring them. So it'd be in perpetuity, you'd be building a new nuclear power plant every day with the associated challenges that we all know of. And then we have the renewable sources, which you'll notice are not all the same size. Some renewable sources are just inherently larger than others. Geothermal, for example, where you're drilling through the crust of the earth to get to the heat that's down below. There's only a few places on Earth where the crust is thin enough that it's really feasible to drill down and get at it. So worldwide, it's not a very big energy source. It works great in Iceland, but not for a major impact on global supplies. So this is 18 terawatts. That's what we use today. And this is what our energy mix looks like today. You guys correctly answered the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas are where we get most of it from. That's the gray part of that box with almost insignificant fractions coming from these other sources. But that's today. I have a 13-year-old. What about when he's middle-aged? In the year 2050, remember we're going to be using 30 terawatts worldwide, almost twice as much energy. So there's a 30 terawatt box. And the question is, what is that box going to be filled with? What is our energy mix going to be? So a lot of folks have projected this, and every year actually the story changes, but a rough picture of the projected scenario would look something like that. This is a frightening projected scenario. So all these other sources grew dramatically because we needed so much more energy. But this actually represents an increase in fossil fuel use, not a decrease. So let's hope that this is not the energy mix in the year 2050 or we're all in an awful lot of trouble. So just hypothetically, let's say by the year 2050, we were going to be off fossil fuels. And I'll tell you now that's actually very unlikely. But hypothetically, let's say we didn't want to use any, and let's avoid nuclear. How much can we get just with the renewable energy sources? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to empty out those boxes, all the wind and biomass and hydropower and so on, everywhere on Earth that is feasible to get. And you can get a lot of energy, but not quite enough to meet the global demand in the year 2050. But if you're paying attention, you'll notice there's a box I didn't show you yet. So now we come to solar. How big is the solar box? So I go from boxes to circles. That's a circle. It's just too big to fit on the screen. And that is the amount of energy hitting the surface of the Earth from the sun all the time. Massive amount of energy. It's enough energy in 1 hour to power the entire planet for a year, which sounds really amazing, except that, of course, you can't capture all of the energy hitting the surface of the Earth. So this is just a rough back-of-the-envelope estimate for how much could you actually capture. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to throw out the oceans. We're not going to put solar panels all over the oceans. So that's land area. You also, of course, can't cover all the land area with solar panels. What's a feasible amount of land to cover? I'm going to say 2% is a feasible amount of land. That's approximately the amount of the United States covered by roads, to give you a sense for what we're talking about. So that cuts us down a lot smaller. 2% of the United States would look like that. We're not going to put all the solar panels in west central Kansas. That's just a 2% of the United States area there. But there's another problem. You can't convert sunlight to electricity with 100% efficiency. There are fundamental losses in that process. The laws of thermodynamics limit you to about 30%, and you can buy panels for your rooftop today that do it at about 22% is the best on the market. So it's already approaching the limits. I'm going to be more conservative and say 12%. Very realistic number. So now we're left with a pretty tiny circle compared to that monster one that we started with. But that tiny little circle on the right side of the screen is that yellow box. So the feasible solar energy supply is more than 2 times larger than the total projected global energy demand all the way out in the year 2050. For all intents and purposes, it's an inexhaustible energy supply. And it's not surprising that solar would be so much bigger than wind and biomass and hydropower, because those are solar energy, just going through extra steps. The wind blows because the sun heats up the air and you get air currents. Extra steps, less efficient. Biomass, plants grow because they do photosynthesis. They use sunlight and make chemical fuel. Hydropower, where did that water come from? It evaporated because of sunlight and then fell on a mountain as rain or snow, and some of that we can dam up and collect as hydropower. So those really are all solar energy, just going through extra steps. So I don't show this to say that we should get all of our energy from solar. That's a terrible idea, actually. But it needs to be a huge piece of the energy mix going forward and much larger than it's projected to be. So what are our options technologically today? There's basically 3 types of panels on the market. Silicon represents the vast majority of the market, roughly 90% of what's out there. And then there's 2 newer technologies called cadmium telluride and CIGS, which stands for copper indium gallium selenide, CIGS. And these all have some advantages and disadvantages, but if you're looking on a 2050 time frame and you're talking about terawatts, you can throw out this one and this one. There's 2 problems with cadmium telluride, cadmium and telluride. Cadmium is toxic. It's not going to hurt you in the solar panel, but it's a concern. But the bigger concern here is the telluride, that's tellurium, also toxic, it turns out, but it's one of the rarest elements on the planet Earth. There's just not enough tellurium to get at feasibly to build enough of these panels to make terawatts of solar power. Same goes here with indium and gallium. So silicon, though, looks great. Lots of silicon. The raw material there is quartz sand, so we're not going to run out of this stuff anytime soon. And there's other good news about silicon. This is a plot of silicon solar panel prices from the 1970s to today. That is a pretty dramatic drop in prices. You can barely even see the bar representing the price today compared to where it was before. So that's good news. Something that was just a pipe dream a few decades ago is now looking a lot more promising. And as we build more and more solar, the price keeps dropping, like economies of scale. This is true in many different markets. So you can kind of fit the way prices have been dropping and look at the future going forward. Now, the price of solar is a little tricky to calculate because it depends where you put your solar panel. If you put it in Southern California or Hawaii, you're going to get more energy out of it than if you put it here in Illinois, and so it'll give you more money. So it depends on your location, but if you look at today, this is the global capacity of solar panels. Today we're at about 200 gigawatts, 0.2 terawatts. You can see that in an average location like Illinois, it costs more to get your energy from solar panels than it does to buy it off the grid, which is why you and I don't have solar panels on our roof. Well, maybe some of you do, but I don't. You can see, though, already, by the way, these are unsubsidized prices. You can see already in sunny locations, like Hawaii, for example, it's already cheaper to get your solar energy this way than to buy it off the grid, and that's why those solar panels are popping up like crazy. But really important thing happens as you build out the scale. As we have more and more global scale in solar and these prices continue to drop, not too long in the future, this line crosses the price on the grid. And at that point, solar is going to need to scale really big and really fast. And here's the problem with silicon. To make silicon solar panels, you need ultra pure silicon, like 99.9999% silicon. And it needs to be crystalline, ideally single crystalline. And to get crystalline, super pure silicon takes a huge amount of energy. So you have to spend energy to make the thing, and then you plug it in and it starts giving you energy back. And the question is, how long does it take you to give back the energy that you put in? And there's a name for that. It's called the energy payback time. Now, the panels will last 30 years or longer, guaranteed by the manufacturer. The energy payback time for silicon, of course, it depends where you put it again, but is on the order of about 2 years. So you'll get back way more energy than you put in, but you're going to have to wait a while to get it. And that will limit how fast you can scale up. So if you have an energy payback time of 2 years, this is the available energy to you from solar energy worldwide. Here we are today, sitting at barely measurable on this graph, again, about a fraction of 200 gigawatts, because there's a capacity factor which makes it even lower. But if you have an energy payback time of 2 years, even if you grow at 20% every year, which for a lot of manufacturing is a pretty crazy pace to grow, you can see that even by the year 2050, we're not making that big a dent in the energy mix because it takes so long to get the energy back. So what we need is other technologies, new technologies that take less energy to make. And that's what we work on at places like Argonne, also here at the University of Chicago, and other research institutions around the world. The idea is to come up with new materials, not silicon, not cadmium telluride, not SIGs. It takes less energy, optimize those solar cells, but you can't stop there. You got to make sure it's scalable. That's where the process engineering comes in. So just a few examples of some of the technologies on the horizon that we study are things called dye-sensitized solar cells, organic photovoltaics, and then the newest one on the scene are called perovskite photovoltaics, which people are super excited about because their efficiencies actually rival silicon already. And they were, so you can make a 20% efficient perovskite solar cell, if you're good, today. 3 years ago, that was like 3%. So skyrocketing efficiencies, really exciting. Let me show you, I actually have an organic photovoltaic module here to give you a sense of some of the other advantages of a technology like this. So if you've seen solar panels, they didn't look like this, probably. They're usually big, heavy, rigid glass things on a rooftop. This you can see is not heavy, and it's mechanically flexible, lightweight. And this thing was printed on essentially a roll-to-roll process with solution processing, the same way newspapers are printed, more or less. And it works. So this is a battery, Kevin. I can plug this thing in, and let's see if we can even get some power here. Charging the, well, it was charging the battery until it came undone. So another advantage of this technology is that it also works in low light conditions. A silicon solar panel is not going to turn on from these lights. There's not enough light intensity. So you can imagine there are applications for panels like this that you just can't even do with traditional solar panels. But the important point for the future is the energy payback time. I told you for silicon it's about 2 years. If you really push the efficiencies, you can maybe get that down to something more like a year, but not much better. Technologies like cadmium telluride already are better in terms of energy payback time. It takes less energy to make those, but I already told you you can't scale those up to be terawatts of power anyway, so who cares, unless you're one of the companies making them. But take a look at a technology like organic photovoltaics. So even with a really low efficiency, so that panel is probably between 1% and 2% efficiency, which sounds terrible. Even at 1% efficiency, the energy payback time is already faster than any commercial technology that's out there. And if you can push that efficiency in a module to match what we can do in the lab, something like 10%, the energy payback time just becomes a week, even a few days. That is impossible with silicon technology. And let me show you what that can do. Remember this plot for silicon with a 2-year energy payback time? Let's say you can lower that down to 1 month. This is what the plot looks like with the same scaling, 20% per year, but now you don't have to wait for that energy. So you can scale up way faster. Now by the year 2050, you can get to 20 terawatts. There's no way to do this with traditional technologies. So with that, I'll just point you to this URL where you can find a little more. If you're a little more geeky and you want to see the details of some of the research going on in Argonne, you can find all kinds of highlights in that website there. And after we hear from Kevin, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
That was terrific. We should just end now. Okay. All right. Kevin Gallagher So one thing about batteries that goes all the way back in time, this is a sort of a legendary story that's much told that I'm going to tell you, but going back 100 years, there have been waves in which car makers and other device makers attempted to commercialize batteries. And there are always inventors who are making promises regarding what they're going to produce with their batteries. And Edison was famous for saying in writing actually in 1911 that as soon as an inventor starts to talk about a rechargeable battery, he starts to lie. And this is where Kevin Gallagher comes in, because Kevin was when I didn't know anything about batteries and just started to be introduced to argon and to batteries and to the science of it. Kevin was the one who clued me in on this law, and slowly I didn't get it. I didn't say, "What do you mean they're liars? What do you mean by that?" And just over time, he let it, in his very subtle way, just sort of come as a wave over me over time. But Kevin didn't only do this as a service to journalism. This is his job at Argonne, and so there has been an innovation hub created at Argonne. It's a 5-year program, $120 million. Argonne won this program, this big institute, and Kevin. I was sitting there as this whole thing materialized, and day by day and week by week rose in the estimation of the much more senior people in the room as a guy who called baloney, right? Who called things as they were. And his job, he created a system that basically calls baloney on future batteries. It evaluates the economics and the realism, the feasibility of new battery technologies, and tells the researcher what he or she has to do to make that work, which is really big, and Edison would love you. So with no further ado, Kevin Gallagher.
Well, Steve, wonderful introduction. I guess I'll be dreaming about what Edison would have said to me had we were to have met. All right. So, the walk, turn me out. All right. So, future of energy storage. I thought I'd take a step back and try to answer why storage. Right. We certainly all understand why you would want batteries or other forms of energy storage because we have them in our pockets right now. But for the electricity grid, why would you need storage, right? It's not something we have a terrible amount of today. And so the story that's usually told, and it's very intuitive and it's also true, is renewables are inherently intermittent. So the sun goes down every night, wind doesn't always blow, and so if you want to harness that energy for other parts of the day, then obviously you need to store it and then draw on it when you need it. But this story is often more complicated than the sort of bedtime tales that we tell each other, and it also makes it a much richer and sort of more interesting area to work in, I think. And so this is a picture of Manhattan, which is not a place that most people think of when they think about energy storage. But this is actually something that's really a hot topic right now in Manhattan, and it's for a number of reasons. One is there's no space, right? And yet our hunger for energy increases every day. And the cost of building a new substation to support, all the hipsters in Brooklyn it's something like $1 billion, right? And there's a way around that, and it involves using batteries. And so you can use energy storage to defer the infrastructure costs that you would have to do just to make a few hours of peak electricity generation each year, right? And so energy storage is a much richer topic that maybe we can get into a little bit later, but I will be relying mostly on the sort of renewables pitch for the remainder of this talk. So how do we store energy today and for the last 100 years or so? It's by pumping water uphill, right? And so you have water at a higher elevation, you let it flow through a turbine, you can generate electricity. Water's great, gravity's very reliable, right? It's a fantastic way to store energy. And this is Bath County, Virginia. It's been called the world's biggest battery. I think it's cheating a little bit, but it's really big. I think it's like 3 gigawatts of power that they can pull out of this. And hydro is important, right? We should do it where it makes sense, and there are areas in the world where it hasn't been fully tapped, and so we should be thinking about building hydroelectric energy sources there. In the US, however, we've pretty much done this where this makes sense, right? So this is more of the past of energy storage, not necessarily the future. So what does the future look like? And I spent a lot of time dealing with scientists, and I could have went really heavy tech on you, but instead I decided to talk about a place that we've all probably loved to have visited if we haven't had the chance itself, and that's Hawaii, right? And so Hawaii, I think, is kind of an example of where we're going in the future, right? And so while living in paradise is wonderful, it also comes with its challenges. One being that you have to generate all of your own electricity, right? I don't know of anyone who's talking about making massive cables to go from California to Hawaii to transmit electrons. And so it has to all be done on site and can be a bit expensive. But the good news is that, as Seth pointed out, solar panels getting less expensive. They're really starting to be integrated onto the grid, particularly in places like Hawaii, and generating sizable amounts of power. And so that's a wonderful thing, but it's causing challenges for sort of the standard way of doing business. And so what I'm showing you is what's now famously called as the duck curve. And I think if you squint, you might actually be able to see one. Although my wife last night told me she didn't see anything here. I guess this is the tail over here on the left and the wing and the head. But essentially what you're seeing is the power demand from standard generators, so the standard utility, as a function of the hour of the day, right? And so in the past, you would have kind of this lull in the morning, and then it would pick up to a relatively steady amount, and then it would peak when everyone got home from work and turn on the AC, heavier TV, everything else. Now with solar panels on the grid, solar is delivering most of its energy and power right in the middle of the day. And so it's causing this dip. And it's actually getting to the point where we're going to have to start either paying people to use electricity or throwing it away, right? And so that's pretty incredible. And then the other question you have to ask yourself, well, what are we doing to make up the power over here in the peak on the far hand right of the graph? And it turns out what Hawaii does is they burn oil, right? And so oil is the way that Hawaii generates most of their electricity, and they ship it over on barges, and they burn it. And Hawaii is a place that's also pretty ecologically minded, right? I mean, this isn't a major metropolitan area. This is a fragile ecosystem, and so there are multiple reasons why someone in Hawaii might want to move away from burning oil to make their electricity. One is, sort of green thinking, environmental thinking. The other one is you're very sensitive to the price of oil. So back when a barrel of oil was over $100, Hawaii was paying something like 40 cents a kilowatt hour during those peak hours. That's incredible, right, for people that live in the Chicago area to think about paying that much for electricity. And so to them, they thought we have to do something different, right? But this isn't just a Hawaii problem. This is now happening in California. So rooftop solar is forecasted in the year 2020 to potentially over-generate electricity, much like what's already happening in Hawaii, right? And so this is now mainland US, this is a huge number of people, and we're talking about gigawatts instead of megawatts, right? So now this is a real economic opportunity for someone that has a solution for something like this, right? Rather than a niche application, this is a major business, right? And so what Hawaii has done, at least in one experiment, to potentially solve this problem, is to partner with Solar City, who has selected Tesla to supply lithium-ion batteries, to create a dispatchable solar energy installation. So what that means is the utility can call on them any time of the day, right? For some reason, there's a big beach party that goes late, and they bring all these lights over at 2 a.m. They can dispatch the solar energy that was generated 8 hours before, right? And so this is kind of game-changing because the price to the utility is 14.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And this is an area that in the not-so-distant past, 5 years ago, was paying 40 cents a kilowatt hour during peak times, right? So here you have an economically viable, in a big way, case to not only have solar, but to include batteries to make it something that you can rely upon and predict upon, right? This is pretty revolutionary, particularly when you also think about its lithium-ion batteries, right? This is not exactly the same, but pretty darn close to what's in your cell phone, right? That's incredible. Something so small can be used to do something so large. And the reason is, Seth showed a very similar graph, right? The sort of economics of these things is that the more you make of them, the more the price drops. And so not only has this happened in solar, it's happened in wind, it's happening with lithium-ion batteries as we speak. And it's making things that were thought as niche products, curiosity of the rich, to really being something that the average consumer can afford to use and might even make economical sense depending on where you live, right? And so this is really, really incredible. And so if I were to ask you, who would you thank for this? I think a large number of people would say, well, obviously Elon Musk, right? Single-handedly transformed the industry. And he certainly deserves credit. I mean, I think he's made batteries sexy, which is no small feat. It's pretty incredible, so I should thank him for that. But really, I like to think of this guy, right? John B. Goodenough, right? He's actually an alumni of the University of Chicago, right? So highlighting Chicago Innovation Week. And he is one of the key inventors of lithium-ion technology. He's not the only one, but I think he's probably the most dynamic, right? I think that's fair to say. Steve can back me up on that, I think. And so John's just an amazing guy, and a little fun fact about him is he's actually even more famous for the work he's done in magnetism and superconductivity than he is in lithium-ion batteries, even though the material he invented is in every single person's cell phone in this room. So he's just one of these amazing people. 93 years old, still comes to work, still does research. And I find that inspiring because, when you look at these learning curves and you see the technology, how fast the price is dropping for lithium-ion, and how it's going to continue to drop as more of it spills into grid storage applications, as electric vehicles, these Model 3 is ramped up, right, and they're making hundreds of thousands of these. You begin to wonder, is anything going to beat lithium-ion, right? Is this it? Is this just now up to the companies to ramp up and to increase in volume? And John Goodenough still comes to work every day trying to make a better battery, right? And so he fundamentally believes that there is a better way to go about doing this, right? And we can get to cheaper storage, longer lasting storage. It's just going to take more hard work, right? And so that is inspiring to me. And as Steve mentioned, I'm a part of a consortium where we're trying to do exactly that, right? And so we've got a large number of universities, a large number of national labs, and 4 companies that we're working together to try to string together how a physicist thinks with what a company needs, right? And so as Steve alluded to, I kind of sit in the center of that. And so I feel pulled in either directions where the scientists all think I'm a jerk and the companies all think I'm unrealistic. And so, lots of friends, as you can tell. But, we are working incredibly hard to try to come up with that next technology. And I think the thing to remember is that these transitions take decades, right? If you think about John Goodenough invented lithium coal oxide in, I want to say, like 1980. In 1991, Sony commercialized lithium-ion batteries, and we're only now really seeing them go mainstream in applications beyond computers, right? And so these things take time. And that's fine because we have technologies right now that are getting us to a point where they can play in the marketplace, right? We just need to keep with a discovery to bring us down to an even lower cost curve. And part of the reason we want to do that is because there's a real opportunity here to do what some of the economics call this leapfrogging, right? So if you think about places in the developing world where there's not an established grid, right? Where there's not reliable, predictable electricity, there's an opportunity there to take solar cells or wind turbines and couple it with batteries. And all of a sudden now you have, in a village perhaps hundreds of miles away from the local utility, an ability to provide electricity at any time, day or night, right? So little kids can do their homework. And this is what is eventually going to improve the quality of life for very many people across the globe. And so with that, I think that's the end of my talk. We can pause.
All right. So Seth, I just want to ask you, just in terms of what's happened to solar, we're describing just a plunge in the cost of solar. What happened to Solar City in Nevada? The subsidies were pulled out, and then Musk pulled out. Can you describe what's happened and why, and what does that mean?
So I don't want to get into specific business cases and what happened, first of all, because it's outside my expertise, and second of all, I'm going to get myself in trouble, I think, if I do too much of that. Maybe I can answer your question more broadly about the challenges with some solar companies that we've had.
Just getting real, right? Just getting real about what, where we are really.
Sure. Yeah. So that panel I showed you, for example, by the way, was made by a company called Konarka. Konarka went bankrupt a few years ago. And my opinion is they were too early with their technology. But the energy marketplace is a really tough marketplace. It is basically how many cents is it going to cost to get a kilowatt hour of electricity, and we don't care if it comes from natural gas or coal or nuclear or wherever it comes from, you got to beat the price that's out there on the market or you're going to fail. And that technology was not ready then, and so that company failed. Now, it gets all a lot more complicated when you talk about price, though, as I alluded to in my presentation, is how do you calculate the price of solar electricity? You know what it costs you to buy the panels and the inverter and to pay the installer to put it on your rooftop and all that. But how much electricity is it going to give you, in the next month, in the next year, in the next 10 years, in the next 30 years, in your location with the climate changing? It's a really difficult thing to figure out. And in fact, you can't say it with certainty. There's inherently uncertainty in that. And so building business models that are going to be successful is going to require just as much, if not more, ingenuity than we're going to have on the technological side. So Solar City is a company, by the way, was there some kind of arrangement that Tesla and, so Solar City and Tesla are both?
Of course not. Why?
Those are both owned by Elon Musk. That's why I was asking the question. So Solar City is an example of overall what's been a pretty successful business model. I don't want to go into the details of their business model, but basically they try and make it lower the barrier for entry to solar by for things like where they can own the equipment and you buy the electricity, for example. And there, I'm sure, will be many more creative models that will come out going forward. Companies are going to come and go, but this really is the only answer for the future. So someone's going to figure it out.
Meaning solar.
Solar.
Solar is the only answer for the
solar
for
plus
the
storage, by the way.
Right.
And this isn't just the future, by the way. This is, if you read solar energy blogs, at least half the stories now are something about solar plus storage in the title. This is just taking off like crazy.
I'd like to add to your comments about business models because I think it's very important to also address, I think I'm on.
Oh, are you?
Yeah, I think, am I? Yes, okay. I think another major point that we can really transform things is if we actually have better platforms to monetize energy. And then we start to enable businesses and even residential units to be able to buy and sell and transact energy where they see fit. And so I would add that to your business model component as well.
Well, all right. So this is a very technical question, but it's one that you see in the newspapers when folks are talking about solar alone and combining solar with storage. And that's the advantage of net metering. Yep. And then, so if you have what battery guys have always told me, if you have net metering, you don't need batteries unless you're in Hawaii. Can you explain that? Yeah.
Yeah, so first, just to get everyone on the same page, net metering is when your electric meter runs backwards when you're generating more electricity from, for example, solar panels than you're using in your home or business. And so you're feeding that electricity on the grid and the utility's buying it from you at some price, depending on what the local policies are. So that is supposed to encourage people to install things like solar panels on their rooftop because they can make money off that electricity that they wouldn't otherwise use. But it's also a disincentive to put storage on your house because if someone's paying you for the electricity, why would you put in extra money, sink money into that battery pack in your house, the Tesla Powerwall or whatever? Now, all of that changes a little bit, though, if you start playing with time of use pricing in electricity. So if you just charge the same rate all the time, that what I said is true. But if you start if you make, when demand is really high, if you jack up what they'll pay you for that electricity, then even if you have storage, you may want to be feeding it to the grid because you're going to make more money that way. So if you put smart policies in place, you can actually encourage both. You can have net metering and energy storage both being encouraged by those policies.
Okay, but when I mean, not to beat this to death, but when Nevada got rid of net metering, shouldn't that have incentivized grid storage?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Seth. All right, Kevin. So battery researchers, at least the ones who I know, and the same ones you know, have kind of not completely lost hope, but have reached, maybe they've reached the Kevin Gallagher position, which is that there isn't something out there identifiable on the margin, on the horizon that's going to get you there. And so you've had this massive embrace of manufacturing. Manufacturing innovation is the new, buzzword in terms of how you get to the next stage of batteries and electric cars. And so two questions. One, do you buy into that? And second, do you have hope? What do you see as the a couple of potentially promising chemistries?
Yeah, sure. I think I did work in manufacturing a few years before grad school, and I don't exactly know the role of public institutions in terms of advanced manufacturing, particularly in the field of batteries. It's one of these things where we always have to be careful, unless it's in a really closely connected public-private partnership, to make sure that we are trying to solve problems that we're the best suited for. And so my experience has been that these companies are very good at innovating their way and reducing the costs associated with manufacturing. And when they have specific needs, they'll come out and find us. And so I think when it's a pool, it's a very good thing. But if perhaps government is pushing, that might not always be the best solution. In terms of future battery technologies, I think we're in a good place because we've kind of made it past the hype, right? And I think in Silicon Valley there's a chart that shows when something new comes out, the hype is just insane, right? And then there's the pit of despair when everyone realizes that they've forgotten about all of these very obvious but important things. And then there's all of a sudden progress, right? And I think we've reached that. It's taken about 8 to 10 years, right? But I think we're getting to a point now where the community has recognized what the real challenges are, and now we can all roll up our sleeves and get to work on those, right? And so lithium metal is something which I think could really improve transportation batteries.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, right. So in current lithium-ion batteries, and one of the miracles and why it works is graphite, which is the negative electrode in lithium-ion batteries, serves as a house for lithium ions to sit in. And it works beautifully, and it really is what allows us to cycle these things hundreds of times, if not thousands of times. But there's a cost associated with graphite. You have to buy it. It also takes up space, and it has mass, right? And so ideally what you would do, instead of having this house or hotel for lithium to sit in, you would just turn lithium into its crystalline state. So there's no excess mass, there's no excess weight, right? And you don't have to pay for it, right? And so this is kind of a step change that's possible in lithium-ion technologies. I'll caution you, it's not a new idea. Scientists aren't always silly, so this is the first thing they tried. But it's very difficult to control, and so that's when they went to their second choice, which turned out to be good enough to revolutionize portable electronics. And so this is a topic that I think is very exciting, and there's some new ideas out there, which you never want to try to solve an old problem with old ideas. And so I'm feeling pretty optimistic about it.
Wow. Okay. Musk is giving us the idea that we can get to this new age of him, of certainly him selling 5 million cars, and he describes this new era as there being a multitude of car makers, and Bloomberg New Energy Finance describes this as 35% of new cars sold in 2030s are pure electric vehicles, much faster than Exxon and OPEC describes. But can that be done, do you think, through manufacturing? Can you get there just through manufacturing innovation, or does there need to be that breakthrough in lithium metal or something?
So the number that people, so batteries alone, right? We exist in this world of gasoline, right? And we have to compete, and it's a matter of also consumer preference, and that's not something I'm an expert in. But the number that people throw around is, around $100 a kilowatt hour is the tipping point between cost competitiveness for an ICE versus say a 200-mile range electric vehicle. And that's something I think we can hit just through manufacturing in the sort of 2030 time frame, right? Now, it's not obvious that the consumer will still choose to buy the electric vehicle. Or maybe in 2030 the culture will be as such as that we'll all be shunned for driving gasoline vehicles. But that's a relatively short period of time from now, 14 years, right? It's can't always predict these sorts of step changes, but I think that's a bit optimistic to think about 35% of all new cars being. In the US, hybrids are only 3 to 5% of all new sales. Now, in Japan, they're 30%. So certainly where you are makes a big difference, but if we're only selling, 3 to 5% Prius-like vehicles in the US, how all of a sudden are we going to jump full electric vehicles to 33%?
There's a key change there, though.
Yeah.
A lot of it is on your point about what the consumer wants. And if it happens to be an electric vehicle that consumers still want, that could change things.
Well, right, so this is the role of consumer taste, social tastes. Seth?
I just wanted to add one more point, which
Yeah.
if you look at a future where there's a carbon tax, the entire equation changes dramatically, both on generation and the drive for things like electric vehicles.
So do we think President Trump is going to put in a carbon tax? Or?
I'm not getting any sort of acclamation here. Okay. All right, Leah, I kind of wanted to go big picture with you. So one of the issues raised, and Seth raised it, was what happens in 2050 in terms of the breakdown of the energy consumption. Recently, Sanford Bernstein, the research house, which is contrarian, but they're also pretty good, forecast that we hit peak demand rather than peak oil or peak supply, peak demand just before 2030, and then a steep plummet. And so you go up to, right now we use 93 million barrels a day. That figure rises to 100 million barrels a day, and by the end of the century, it's 20 million barrels. So we don't get off of oil. We're still burning oil. How do you create the kind of energy that will propel an airliner, for example? Right. So for some purposes, you do need liquid fuel, but the rule still goes. The Stone Age didn't die because we ran out of stones.
Yeah, which was said, by the way, by a Saudi Arabian oil minister you were referring to earlier. Yeah.
You see? Okay. Anyway, so I wondered how you view this. So, Seth sort of threw out, possible scenarios. Here we have a
Right.
Bernstein scenario. What happens?
Right.
Just give us the whole century,
Sure. So
decade by decade.
how I view this is the crystal ball. So how I view this is alluding back to some of the comments that I made in my talk about being able to model and simulate. So none of us can exactly predict what will happen, but I think that there are a couple of really important ideas here. Is we need to actually start to have better methods to quantify uncertainty and risk associated with different scenarios, and then understand what those scenarios look like and understand what certain types of interventions we'll have based on different scenarios. Otherwise we can all have ideas about what things will look like in 2050. But But I think the more realistic approach is to have the best possible understanding we can of different scenarios, model them in different ways, and then actually have an ability to influence, particularly with policy and regulation. I had a very good mentor early on at Argonne who said, don't get too wrapped up in being at a science lab, because that's great and it's fine and it's important. We need to do it. But a lot of this really comes back to policy and regulation. So the ability to figure out how to change those levers and what kind of impact they'll actually have, I think is the most appropriate approach to trying to predict what will things be like in 2030 or 2050, because in my opinion, anyone who tells you they know what things will look like in 2050 probably doesn't know.
Hey, Steve, can I, since we want to interact more in the panel, I think your earlier comment about, the grid itself it's regulated, it's not necessarily an open market, right? And so this inherently slows down adoption of new technology, and it's probably not going to look all that different a few decades from now if things don't change, right? And so the point that hit out to me is that batteries on their own often do not make economic sense for grid storage, but when you can stack various value propositions, meaning I'm going to do arbitrage, I'm going to buy low and sell high, but I'm also going to do things to make the grid more resilient, also now you can make an economic case. So maybe you have some comments about if you see the folks in Washington or the various regulatory commissions opening up the grid so that everyone sees time of use pricing and allows all these things to come in. I mean, how big of an effort is that, and how long does it take just to get that done?
Well, I think what you see is a pretty powerful, of course, and it'll be a challenge. I mean, that's to open up markets like that. I think what we've seen is that's a tough one to say what will actually happen with. I'm not sure that I could actually really say what will happen or what will be the driving force to kind of open things up. But I think you have, as with anything, you have kind of historical influences at play. You have, like I said, organizations that have been around for a long time that their interests are not to do that, and organizations whose interests are to do that. So it's like everything. I think we'll see how things play out, but it's hard to say for sure what that will look like.
Okay. Do we have questions? This gentleman here.
Thanks very much. I think between the three of you or the four of you.
Identify yourself.
My name is Mark. I'm a neighbor, an alum, and doing some work at Booth. You hit on all the main points. I'd love to hear somebody in one of these talks talk about terawatts versus terawatt hours, energy versus power, but that's getting a little geeky, I guess. But on the terawatts, the 30 terawatts that we're going to need, is that primary energy or final energy? And the reason I'm, of course, because solar is primary and final to a large extent. So I'm wondering if how that factors in. And also if you could talk a little more about the 2-year payback, energy payback. As solar panels are coming down to about 50 cents a watt now.
Yeah, that's energy payback, not dollars payback.
Right, I understand.
Huge difference.
But
in
don't
concept.
they tend to come down together, or I guess you're saying they don't?
No, yeah, because there's just inherent, that was a lot of questions. Let me see if I can remember all of them as I go through. So there's inherent energy required to transform quartz sand into solar grade silicon and to make it crystalline. You got to melt it, you got to go through things called the Siemens process and so on. It just takes energy. I mean, you can get a little bit better, with some improvements here and there in manufacturing, but it's very mature already. You're talking about incremental changes, not revolutionary changes in silicon. These next generation technologies is a whole other ballgame, though, in terms of the embedded energy. In terms of the energy growth, something, by the way, I probably should have said during my presentation, I didn't, is that the greatest correlation with GDP across the globe is energy. If you give a country more energy, their GDP goes up with that energy supply, just beautifully. And so, people talk about, well, is this really going to go up? Well, yes, unless development in the world just stops, that demand is going to happen because it just goes hand in hand with development. Energy and development are inseparable, at least through the entirety of human civilization to date. So that is going to happen. I can't remember if I missed one of your questions.
Primary energy versus
Primary energy, yeah.
It is the 30 terawatts that we're going to need with fossil fuels.
You mean that in terms of what we need to produce? Yeah, it is. So, and I should also clarify, when I showed the plots of energy available versus capacity for photovoltaics, that's actually available energy. Another thing you have to take into account is the capacity factor. So, when you install a gigawatt solar plant, it's not going to give you a gigawatt of electricity all the time. It gives you roughly 30% of that. Same goes with wind. It's 20 to 30% capacity factor. So that was the actual available energy is what I was plotting there, not the capacity.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Okay, all you talk at once. All right. Let's go for this man right here.
Okay. I'm Chandra Bhatt from Fermi National Accelerator Lab. This is regarding a question regarding the energy transport once you produce the energy for the grid in general. So, what is the current status of superconductors being used in the grids? So, high temperature superconductors or low temperature superconductors? What is the current status of that one? And
Okay.
how the research is going on?
Okay, 1 second. I'm going to take 3 questions at the same time, so we get everyone. Let's take this gentleman right here, and then that one right there, that guy right there. Yeah.
I'm Jay Marhofer of Intelligent Generation, and I was at the Energy Storage Conference in Charlotte a few weeks ago. The price curve of lithium ion is actually dropping faster than PV. And thus, if you look at electric vehicles, they're going to reach parity with the ICE fairly soon, lower cost of ownership, and about 80 cents a gallon in terms of the equivalent. If you look at the US grid today, our peak demand is about a terawatt. And 10% of the vehicle fleet, 30 million cars with fast charging, will demand a terawatt, most of it behind the meter. So the question is, in a perfect world, how would you see the business model of the utility construct change to accommodate that? Because most of this will be outside of the utility's control, but you need certainly, from a reliability and a safety standpoint, to maintain levels of service that we have now.
Thank you. And then this gentleman right here.
Well, quick comment, if it's permitted before the question. I really appreciated the Dr. Goodenough slide, and I think he's a true hero and not Elon Musk, so that was meaningful to me. Thank you. My question for the panel is related to carbon pricing. If you were elected president, what would you do in terms of carbon price strategy? And if you were to set a price, what would it be in terms of cost per metric ton? Thank you.
Okay, great. Do you want to take the grid question? I mean, the first?
The superconductivity thing?
Yeah.
I mean, was that the question, or like where is that status? So, all right, so the idea here is that you lose energy during the transmission. There are losses as the electrons flow through the wires to get from the power plant to you, which, by the way, gets mitigated somewhat when you have distributed generation with solar panels on homes. You're not dealing with as much transmission. Side point. So the argument goes, well, what if you could have lossless transmission lines that worked perfectly, 100% transmission? And you can do that with something called a superconductor. And we have superconductors, and you could make wires out of them. The problem is they have to be cooled down to relatively low temperatures to become superconducting, and so you'd have to have, like liquid nitrogen jacketed transmission lines and all this kind of stuff, and then the costs just become crazy. So there's been, for many, many years, and in fact, Argonne's been a leading laboratory. The director of J. Caesar, the organization where he works, George Crabtree, made his name in studying superconductivity. So Argonne, for many years, has been studying that, and it's been a goal. Can you make a room temperature superconductor or something close to room temperature? And no one's made one yet. Hopefully someday there will be a breakthrough there, and that will happen. But until then, if you really want to make superconducting transmission lines, you're going to need to cool them substantially. And I don't know if the economics make sense, but my guess is that they probably don't, versus the loss of what's in the current lines. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, now the business model to accommodate EVs, Kevin, would that be you? Do you want to answer that, or
maybe
because
more
we have carbon
business.
pricing?
I mean, I
We
think
have carbon pricing, and we have.
I think a lot of this
Sure.
can be
Yeah.
solved with time of use pricing, right? I mean, it's ridiculous that most of us, and I think actually in Chicago we have the opportunity to do this, but most of us do not see these various dips and ebbs and flows of the market, right? And if we all could use our electricity when it was less expensive, especially if we didn't care, right? If for some reason running your dishwasher was very energy intensive, you could just run it at 2 in the morning, right?
Yeah, and have a smart appliance that does that for
Right,
you.
exactly.
So that
I mean,
it monitors
and
the
of course,
price.
all this
Yeah.
technology exists, right? It's just a matter of regulation and implementation more than it is, and you know, there's no science involved here. That's already been done.
I completely agree. And I think the other component to that is shifting a business model that is much more consumer-centric and to really catering to what it is that the consumer will want and actually having an ability to interact with the consumer in a way that really historically utilities in their business models haven't really had to do.
Is there any indication that what you both just said is recognized by the industry or moving this direction?
I don't think it's a secret, yeah, but it's this, it alludes back to the question that Leah and I were discussing earlier, which is how do you open up, you know, this old, closed-off industry to, you know, where we are today? And it's going to take time and effort and some real leadership, both in DC and across the country.
So
and I'll
it is-
say I'm certainly not the right person to speak on behalf of the industry, so
Right,
to speak.
right.
I think that's why we're all struggling
Yeah.
a bit with this. But what I will say is certainly there seems to be a general sense of recognition that things are changing. You can either change with it or things will change and you can stay with whatever it is that you're doing, but you might not be around.
Yeah, this is one thing that I've struggled with is that I hear that things that the industry recognizes that things are changing in quotes, but then when I see who said that, it's always the same guys from the same company. So it makes me wonder how many of them, you know, really do recognize that. Carbon pricing. What
The
should
short
the
answer is
policy-
yes. I mean, what it will cost, you know, I think that there are all sorts of different models, a lot with different, you know, very valid suggestions and results. You know, I wouldn't go as far as to put a specific price here tonight without a more thoughtful analysis. I'll defer that. But the short answer is yes.
What you said was, what would you do if you were president? I would hire a bunch of really smart economists to figure that out. And there are really smart economists who have already tried to figure that out, and the ranges vary a lot because there's so much uncertainty. I've seen everything from $30 to over $100 per ton.
But I think we have seen now, right? The experiment's been done around the world, right? You look at places like Germany. Electricity is more expensive. Gasoline is more expensive. Their economy, you know, you could probably argue whether that slowed growth to some extent, but at the end of the day, they're the gem of the EU, right? I mean, they're doing just fine. And they've basically paid for a big part of the solar panel revolution, right? They paid China to make all these panels to drive the price down.
Yeah, and in fact, just I think it was a week ago that you were talking about we may have to actually pay people to use electricity. They did, actually.
Right.
The price went negative.
Yeah, but even in Germany, most of the people, like the consumers, do not pay real-time time of pricing because they have this huge tax on top of what they pay per kilowatt hour.
And that's been even here in Illinois, we've seen the nuclear industry really struggle, at times even having negative pricing, because we are incentivizing heavily the renewables, and as we see in all the headlines and so forth, it's an industry that is really struggling right now to stay open. So the different impacts that these things have, you know, we want to make sure we're not having unintended consequences as well.
That's right.
It seems hard to imagine, especially in the current political environment, that we're going to have a carbon price. That was called silence. Okay, questions? 1, 2, 3. 4. Okay, we'll take these 4. Yeah.
Scott Simpson. I'm a student at Chicago Booth. On the subject of batteries and energy storage. So, you know, everyone talks about battery density and storage capacity and all the parameters of the battery itself. People have written entire books about that subject. But that's only half of the battery conversation. The other half is the recharging factor. And I know that Argonne, at least the automotive unit right now, is testing wireless recharging. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts if you're involved in that project, where you see that going, how that changes. You know, you were skeptical of the 30% mark on electric vehicles. You know, our ancillary technologies out there that might change that progression.
Great, thank you. Let's get this.
So thank you for the panel today. I'm an undergraduate student, and from here we have two very clear messages. One is that for the very long run of time, we are not going to avoid using fossil fuel as an energy supply. And the second thing is, it seems like it is impossible to use a fossil fuel in a very environmental friendly way. Which means in terms of the emission level. My question is that really impossible to use a fossil fuel more environmental friendly in the future? And the second question is, which challenge do you think that is more bigger to use fossil fuel in a very environmental friendly way, or to scale up the use of renewable energy?
That's good. Okay.
Hi, I'm Bill Peters. I work at Illinois Commerce Commission, previously at Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. So a couple questions. One is, what year is self-supply competitive with grid supply electricity? And if the prices are going down like they're going down. And two, is there any kind of problem with self-supply in a dense area such as Manhattan or, dense cities?
And there was someone, here we go.
Michael Byerman, founder of Next Wave Power Technologies, and also a participant in the Social Venture Challenge we just finished up today. One question I have is about the market of the existing lithium-ion battery cells that we're seeing, for example, in the Tesla Powerwall, and all those pretty much have the surplus Samsung cells in them, versus what we're going to, what Tesla hopes to build at the Gigafactory, and the pricing of where they are now versus where they're going. There's a bit of a donut hole in there that I've been looking at, and I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Okay, thank you. All right. The first question is on wireless recharging, and I just wanted to broaden that out. Whoever wants to discuss this, but it is the other question is just the broad question of building out infrastructure for recharging cars.
So I think it's a tantalizing idea, right? It would solve a lot of problems. You wouldn't need such a big battery if you could wireless recharge it on certain highways and things like that, and certainly would make charging at home a lot easier. You just drive in. So this is an active area of research. I don't know that it's on any serious automakers, sort of at least 10-year, probably even 20-year time frame, but that can change, right? Certainly it's something they talk about, but what I'm hearing the automakers talk about a lot right now is 350 kilowatt charging, which is enormous. And what's the consequence on the battery for being able to really do fast charge? And the rule of thumb is that a fast charging battery is not the cheapest battery. So you can do it, but there's a cost associated with it. And so it comes back to, again, what does the consumer want? And if it turns out the only acceptable mass market electric vehicle is one that can handle 350 kilowatts, well, all of a sudden, the battery cost challenge just got a little bit tougher.
What about standardization of the whole device and the whole thing?
So that's getting better, actually. I think from the charging perspective, there's people actually at Argonne. Keith Hardy leads an interoperability center between the U.S. and Europe, building standards and making sure that not every line in the standards have to be exactly the same, because that'll just never happen, but the key lines do, right? And so that is where you can use a simple adapter to make the same plug in a car work for a charging station in Europe versus a charging station in the U.S., right? And so I think standardization is one of those invisible hands which does play a big role in bringing costs down. And as the markets grow, you'll just see more and more of that.
Do you see the invention of an adapter to plug your Bolt into a Tesla supercharger?
Well, Tesla, yeah. Well, they opened up all their patents, so I don't know. Maybe at some point, Elon has taken the position that he wants electric vehicles to win in general. So we'll see, I guess.
Yeah.
But Tesla again has led the way by saying you have to be able to do a supercharge, whatever that means. And so now the big three and the VW and other companies are trying to get ready for that.
Okay, Leah, why don't you take this one, the second question right here. Fossil fuels. Is it really impossible to make fossil fuels more environmentally friendly?
Well, I think the short answer to that is Seth hit on that in his talk, that this is not going away for any time soon. That said, there's a responsibility to use fossil fuels in the most responsible way that we know how. Unfortunately with all of this, there's just no single solution. And it'd be really nice to say, let's do more of this and ignore this, but that's just not the situation that we're in. We really, I hesitate to use the cliche, but the above all approach is really what is talked about, and there's a good reason why.
So let me add to that. So you asked specifically about if it's harder, which is the bigger challenge, because they are both big challenges. So if you're talking about carbon, the technology that would make the fossil fuels more friendly is carbon capture and sequestration. And those technologies are way less developed than the renewable energy technologies. There is nothing out there that's within probably 2 decades of being viable, whereas we have renewable energy technologies that are viable today. So I think that's my answer to your question, is which is harder. I don't think we can rely on capture and sequestration as our way to solve this problem, because no one has yet developed a technology that looks like it's going to be ready even in 10 or 20 years.
And then as soon as whatever becomes cost competitive, that is what will, that's where we see things start to shift.
And another point, I'm sorry, I don't want to hog the mic here, but we're shifting, as Steve alluded to at the beginning, from coal to natural gas. And that's in principle good from a carbon standpoint, because natural gas is less carbon intense than coal. However, natural gas is methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas. It's actually 80 times stronger than carbon dioxide, and there are leaks everywhere. And so as we're expanding, hydraulic fracturing and all this, which has been such a boon for our economy and energy independence and all kinds of other things, that unfortunately is also putting all kinds of methane up into the atmosphere, which we may have less carbon warming, but no one knows exactly what's going on, but it's probably being counteracted, if not even more so, by all those methane leaks.
Yeah, this is sort of two groups of people, the frackers, but also battery makers. Frackers need to understand that if they want to go on with the freedom of commerce, they need to themselves proactively become more environmentally friendly, for example, by plugging the methane leaks. But battery makers too need to, I get questions all the time. I'm certain someone is going to ask it tonight. What happens when the battery's dead? Where do you dispose of the battery?
Solar panels too.
Right. So those guys need to get in front of that train. Now, third question. I can't read my own writing, but I'm going to try. What year does self-supply have parity with the grid? And is there any problem in that calculation with putting this technology in a dense environment like a city?
No-brainer competitive.
Okay, who wants to go at that?
Well, I showed for solar, for example, that it depends. First of all, it depends where you are, both because the price of electricity is different where you are and because there's different amounts of sunlight and also temperature and other things that can affect how much energy those panels will generate. But there are places where it's already unsubsidized grid competitive in the sunniest places where, for example, Hawaii, it's very expensive to get your electricity there, and it's also very sunny, so that's like the perfect storm, and it is grid competitive there already. There are many other places where that's true too today, but as those prices drop, those regions where that's true just blossom and eventually are everywhere.
Okay, and the density?
Oh, yeah, so this is a legitimate point, that if you wanted to say, well, in an ideal world, everyone just generates their power from solar panels in their own building, but if you're in downtown Chicago on a skyscraper, that's not realistic. There's just not enough footprint. We get a certain amount of energy per square meter from the sun here on Earth. And the amount of energy you're using in that footprint is much more than what the sun is giving you in that footprint. So it's not realistic to power the Sears Tower with solar panels on the Sears Tower. Sorry, the Willis Tower. So yes, in a home you can do that. You can generate it all locally, but in a very dense environment you can't. And so you can either have farms, solar farms nearby and wind farms and so on that are moving the energy there, or you can also get it from other sources, fossil and nuclear and other traditional sources.
I just want to ask, what time are we trying to end? Oh, okay, so I'm holding on. I did not forget the fourth question, but I want to, all of the questions came from this side. And so I want to add questions. You guys cannot ask any more questions. All right, let's take these three. There's someone right here.
So broadly, you had one slide on there that talked about the energy payback periods. Why do you have to pay it off only with PV? You could get all the nuclear plants in the United States to power one single factory that build all the silicon, and then you have all the silicon you need to make solar panels 10 years from now or 5 years from now, and you're done with fossil fuels entirely.
And one more.
Hi, Bert Mayer from the Boston Consulting Group. My question's about distributed energy and how we should think about the relationship of a shift towards renewables to distributed energy resources, and what are the barriers and unlocks toward a future in which distributed generation and virtual power plants and aggregation and orchestration feature prominently.
Okay, the first, I'm looping back, thank you very much, looping back to the final question here, which I think is for Kevin, and it's battery pricing. Where are we? The question was specifically about Tesla, right?
Well, we have a significant surplus of Samsung cells that are on the market that are part of this distributed generation on the residential side, which is grossly affecting the pricing of those systems. Those cells are going to be gone, and they're going to have to manufacture cells to meet that same price target somewhere else.
Yeah, I don't, so they are in a loss leader type situation right now, right, where they're, I wouldn't say giving away, but certainly perhaps selling at a no profit environment. But I think that's, while selling at a loss is not sustainable in the long term, the prices that they're selling at can and will be achieved by lithium-ion battery manufacturers in the future, near future. So I think it's incredible, right? Again, you never underestimate an established technology that's already on a learning curve, right? I think that's the lesson to take away, and there's probably plenty of other photovoltaic technologies that would say the same thing, right? It's as soon as you get your foot in the door, you're able to learn on a platform like computers and smartphones and make your technology better there, where maybe the demands aren't quite as high as they are in a car for the energy grid. And you can get all of that learning in place, and then you grow into the bigger market, and it's just going to be incredibly difficult for other battery technologies to catch up with that. And I think that's the lesson that a lot of us in the battery community are learning at the moment.
Great. Leah, again, this one is probably for you, big picture. One hears this a lot, especially from climate scientists, that the outcomes are already baked in, right? That the heating of the planet and the apocalyptic outcomes, they're already baked in, and all we can do is try to sort of erode, around the edges. And this is the spirit of this question: have we already baked in the pollution? Are we on this environmental decline? Okay, can you do that in one sentence?
I'll do my best. Briefly, the one sentence is we have to try. I mean, the option is what? We just say we're doomed? Are humans really to that point? And I would say no. So, to the point of certainly trajectories need to change. But, to just say things are baked, I one, don't think that's the right approach. And two, I think we need to have some humility in terms of looking back at where we've also come from. And frankly, also the amount of damage we've done in a short amount of time and the amount of incredible, brilliant progress on many, many fronts we've made in a short amount of time as well.
Yeah, and there's in fact a lot we don't know, right? The climate is a very complicated thing. Payback on silicon.
Yeah, so the question was, why don't we just use nuclear plants or something else to build? Energy is energy. We are using that power now to keep these lights on. If you're going to divert all that energy there, now you need to replace that with something. What are you replacing it with? We're trying to replace it with solar panels. So that's why when I built that model, very simple model, admittedly, I was just using photovoltaic energy to make the solar panels because we're already using the energy that we have. The demand is going up. We need more and more energy, right? So there's not like excess energy just sitting around that we can grab to make all these, to purify silicon.
If I was the one with the factory, I'd build a power plant, and then the whole planet in a much shorter amount of time would have silicon it needs to go without the fossil power.
It's cheaper to build the solar panels than to build the nuclear power plant.
Well, I'd use fossil.
Okay, you guys debate that at the end. Let's go to the last question, and it'll be one of you two, Seth or Leah. Distributed energy, barriers. What are barriers to this future?
Well, Kevin was alluding to some of that with the sort of structure of regulated utilities have some things that make, that sometimes serve as disincentives, for example, for distributed generation. It's not necessarily in the traditional utility business model to want you to be making electricity. And there are, I should say, some very progressive utilities out there that recognize the importance and value of distributed energy, and they're even trying to work it into their own business models. Those are the smarter ones, in my opinion. Now, there are also, by the way, some significant advantages for the grid, and Leah's probably better to address that than I am in terms of reliability. When you start building things like microgrids and so on, your resilience against intentional hacking and things like that go way down. And the only way you can have those type of microgrids is when you have distributed generation.
Okay, cool. Do you want to add anything?
Well said.
That's it, okay. We are at time. Let me just say, if anyone has anything more, especially we deprived this side, we're going to be here for a while. Come on up and ask. Thank you very much for coming. Let's say thank you, panelists.